All right, welcome everyone. I'm really delighted to have Bjarte Bogsnes from actually Spain at the moment, but from Europe generally joining us today. I was really lucky to have a day just on this beyond budgeting topic in Berlin late last year. And, I found it very informative. It was really approachable for someone who hadn't got a finance background. I'm generally not a finance guy, so it was really the sort of thing that helped me to speak more effectively with people about budgets and how we can get beyond what I've heard quite a few people in Australia say is the funding model as the constraint on our agile adoption. So yeah, Bjarte's written multiple books on this topic and the chairman of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable. And yeah, it's really the number one person you want to hear from if you want to think about how all this relates, because I think as Bjarte will point out, it's not just about the dollars and the budget. All of these things kind of interrelate with changing of mindset and culture and other systems in organizations. So yeah, I'm really excited to do this evening. Just one thing to note, and we'll perhaps refer to this at the end of the session as well, as Bjarte is offering a two-part online course, just I think 2 4-hour sessions. That's coming up in late May. Is that right? It's not too far away now, 21st, 22nd of May. So that's actually running through a organization called Complexability. And yeah, if you're interested in that, I'd really encourage you to reach out to them. There's 2 different websites we can point you to, but we might just share the links as we go a bit as well on that. So yeah, something to get involved with if you want to get a little bit deeper into it than just this sort of introductory session this evening. But yeah, without any further ado, I'd like to just invite you all to welcome Bjarte. Thank you, Bjarte.
Thank you, Rowan, and hi, everybody. Yes, I am a finance guy. I'm not an IT guy, but I'm a finance guy that has actually also worked in human resources, which is, as you will find out, highly relevant for what I will talk about, because beyond budgeting, despite its name, is about much more than budgets. It is about business agility. We've been around actually longer than agile. If you look at our principles, they were formulated actually a few years before the Agile Manifesto. Many similarities, but also some differences, as I will come back to. Of course, I'm not entirely objective here, but I think one of the reasons why companies struggle with scaling Agile is that Agile was not designed as a way to run an enterprise. It was about software development and how teams work, and it did wonders. But if you try to scale this stuff, then the holes in Agile become visible. There is so much the Agile Manifesto didn't have to talk about, which you have to talk about if you want to run an enterprise. And these are the holes that beyond budgeting is filling. And I hope you will understand how as we go through my slides here. So I'm going to share my screen here, and can somebody confirm that you can see my slides? Very good. Excellent. Excellent. So I'm also the chairman of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, which is an international network of individuals and companies interested in beyond budgeting. And the reason it says Bogsnes Advisory here at the bottom is that I left corporate life a couple of years ago to be able to work full time with beyond budgeting. I have been working with this for almost 30 years, but always kind of next to a real job. But now this is my real job. Every time I talk about beyond budgeting, there's one word that keeps coming up, and that is control. And I guess you understand the context, why it's coming up. It is about the fear of losing control. when I hear this, I often ask people, okay, what do you mean with control? Can you please explain what you are so afraid of losing? And the interesting thing is that after people have said cost control, many actually go quiet. They struggle with kind of putting words on what they are so afraid of losing, which I find quite interesting. So I checked up in Oxford Dictionary, how would they define control? And they call it the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. And what does this mean in organizational terms, business terms? Well, basically two things. It's about controlling people and controlling the future. And behind these two lies the two main assumptions behind traditional management. Number one, you can't trust people. Number two, the future is predictable and plannable. And you know, as well as I, that this is not true. This is what we are challenging in Beyond Budgeting, because these are more illusions of control. Of course, people can be managed, but if they are managed in stupid ways, hopefully they find a way around in order to get their job done. And when it comes to the future, well, the only thing we know is that we don't know. Talking about trust, I've always traveled a lot, and the first I always check when I come into the hotel room at night is what kind of clothing hangers do they have? And I think we can all agree that we all prefer the one at the top with a hook compared to that stupid one at the bottom, which is a hassle to use. So how come some hotels offer us these stupid hangers? And you know why. It is about a few stolen hangers with a hook. And what was the response? To punish everybody because somebody did something wrong. Actually, one of the problems with traditional management, which I will come back to. Wise people out there has very much agreed with what I just have said. Good old Peter Drucker, a wonderful quote. I would very much agree with what he said here. And when it comes to planning, corporate planning, another wise person, Russell Acuff, he compared a lot of the planning he was observing in especially large organizations. He compared it with a ritual rain dance. It has no effect on the weather, but those who engage in it think it does. And I can relate to this as well, because I have done a lot of dancing in my life. My first management job in what is one of Scandinavia's largest company, an energy company, used to be called Statoil, today Equinor. My first management job after graduating from business school was actually head of the corporate budget department. So a lot of dancing. I think the dancing was great, but I'm not sure it really improved the performance of the organization. I think if it did, it was probably in a negative and not in a positive way. All right, so much for wise people. Imagine an organization that 100 years ago invented a fantastic machine. It was state of the art and key for the success of this organization. 50 years ago, this machine started to make some trouble, and today it looked like this, completely broken. This is not a true story, because in real life, hopefully people would have done something 50 years ago, either try to fix this machine or even better, try to invent a new machine, new, different and better, because innovation is something we all love, right? We all want to be leading edge, unique, right there on the forefront, better than everybody else. But that enthusiasm for innovation seems to be limited to technology innovation into products and services and so on. But there is, as you know, also something called management innovation, which is not great. That feels scary, right? Kicking out the budget, are you crazy? The consequence is that it's very crowded on the left-hand side because everybody is into that kind of innovation in some form or shape. Management innovation is not yet a crowded place because it feels scary, which is actually good news for brave companies who dare to explore and embrace also this kind of innovation, because you can get just as much competitive advantage and performance out of management innovation as you can get from technology innovation. So this performance word is important. That is why we should go beyond budgeting, because it is good for performance. And I will come back to more about that later. this important word performance and how beyond budgeting helps. But before that, it is still called beyond budgeting. So it has also something to do with budgets and solving budget problems. So before we move on, I'd like to share with you my budget problem list. And as I go through it, I'd like you to think through, are there any of these problems that you haven't experienced in your own career? It's a very time-consuming process, making budgets, following up budgets. Some people think this is the biggest problem. It's not, but it does belong on the list. Assumptions quickly outdated. We know all about that. This is a serious problem. Budgeting can stimulate what I would call at least borderline unethical behaviors. The lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the frenzied December spending, all those behaviors that we don't want to see between colleagues. At the same time, I'm not blaming anyone for behaving like this, because these people are just responding to the system we have designed for them to operate in. So as you well know, if we want to change behavior, it's not about fixing people, it's about fixing systems, which is what beyond budgeting does. It can create these illusions of control that we just talked about. And of course, it might feel very comfortable to have next year described with a million details and decimals. But again, the only thing we know is that we don't know. So if we don't have control, whatever that word means, maybe it's better to accept it, acknowledge it, and act accordingly, than to think that we have control, to fool ourselves and act accordingly. Budgets force us to make decisions too early. We have to decide in the autumn, the year before, what we shall do next year, what it shall cost. And in larger organizations, often too many of these decisions are taken too high up. Budgets can prevent us from doing stuff that we should have done. We can't because it's not in the budget. But this sometimes also works the other way around. Maybe it can lead us to do things that we shouldn't have done, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it, for the reasons we just talked about. And linked to this, I fully accept that a cost budget can be a very effective ceiling for cost. But let's not forget that it's just effective as a floor, because these budgets tend to be spent as we just talked about. And to define good performance, through budgets and hitting budget numbers is a very narrow, mechanical, and very often a completely irrelevant, outdated way of defining performance. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent performance language. And even if I can't see you guys now, I'm sure that if I asked for are there any of these problems that you haven't experienced in your organization, I don't think I would have seen many hands. And if that is the case, you are in very good company, because I've been sharing this list of problems with hundreds of thousands of people around the world in the 30 years I've been working with Beyond Budgeting. And almost everybody out there agrees, executives, finance people, managers, and others. At the same time, the majority of these companies still continue doing stuff that they admit is a bit stupid, which is quite interesting. I have a theory about why, which I will come back to. But before that, I'd like to add on one more problem that not too many have on their list. I've called it conflicting purposes. I'll come back to that problem later on. It is a bit special, so I'll come back to it. But again, how come so many companies continue doing this stuff? Maybe because even if these problems are recognized, then they are regarded more as irritating issues and not symptoms of a bigger, more systemic and deeper problem. But that is exactly what these problems are. And they also represent the kind of paradox, as I will come back to. First of all, I mean, this is quite an old management technology. In case you don't know it, budgeting is roughly 100 years old as a management technology. And the inventor of this stuff was Mr. James O. McKinsey, the founder of McKinsey Consulting. I never met Mr. McKinsey, but I actually don't think he was an evil person. I think he had the best of intentions. He wanted to help organizations perform better. This was management innovation 100 years ago. And I'm sure it worked 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago. But today, this way of thinking, this way of leading, this way of managing is doing exactly the opposite. It has become more of a barrier than a support for getting out the best possible performance. So I would like to come back to that important word performance here for a few minutes in a somewhat different setting than business and organizations. I would like us to move into traffic, because in traffic, we would also like to experience good performance when we are out driving. And for me, that would mean a safe and good flow. And this is something we often meet when there is crossing traffic, and this light has no sensors, okay? And the one who is in control here, who makes decisions about when you have to stop and when you can drive, well, that is the person who programmed this light. And where would that person be as you sit there waiting? Well, somewhere else. I don't think there's anybody sitting inside that pole. And the information this programming would be based on would not be entirely fresh information. It would be some historical data, some forecasts, but again, not fresh information. Fortunately, there is an alternative. Very different solution, the roundabout, same questions, very different answers. Because here, we decide, we make decisions based on fresh real-time information. So very different answers. Could be interesting to compare these two ways of managing. So let's do that, and I got a few leading questions for you here. It's actually proven scientifically that the roundabout is not just more efficient, it's actually also safer, and lifetime cycle cost is lower. But we also know that it's more difficult. It takes more competence from us to drive in the roundabout. And going back to our organizations and the stuff we need to leave behind of traditional management, in many ways, it is much easier for everybody involved compared to what we need to move towards. But we can't go for what's easy because it's easy. We have to go for what is best for performance, even if it takes more from us. So beyond budgeting does change work for everybody, not just leaders, not just finance people, but in a positive way. It makes work more meaningful, more value-adding, more forward-looking, more continuous, and so on and so on. The list is long. But it's not enough with fresh information and the authority to act on it. We also need a positive value set. If there's a value set among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest, that mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light. But in the roundabouts, oops, just a minute. In the roundabout, me first, don't care about the rest, is actually a big problem, because here we are much more dependent on everybody involved sharing a positive wish or purpose of wanting this to flow well. We need to help each other. We need to interact with each other in a very different way that you need to do in front of that light. Two other important words. Trust is obviously one. We are not trusted in front of that light. In the roundabout, we are. Transparency. Not important in front of the light as long as you can see the color. In the roundabout, you need to be able to see everything in order to make the right decision. The roundabout is the more self-regulating way of managing, and beyond budgeting is very much about self-regulation. And organizations need more self-regulating management models for at least two reasons, and you would be, I mean, you would know this stuff. We need it because of the business environment out there with a much higher VUCA level than when I started my budget and planning career in the early 80s. But they also need it when they look internally at their employees, asking themselves what kind of employees do we generally believe that we have in the organization. And we are a big fan of Douglas McGregor and his theory X and Y. These positive and negative views on what drives motivation in organization and what makes people tick and perform. And as you know, theory X is quite a negative view, on employees, while theory Y is a much more positive view on employees, a view that most people actually want to perform, want to do a good job, want to be involved, want to be listened to, want to be treated as adults. And our conclusion on that question, where do we think employees are, mostly on the X side, mostly on the Y side, must also drive the design of our management models. So just like if there's a high VUCA level, that must have implications. If we mainly believe that people is on the Y side, that must have implications. Versus the opposite. So if you combine the two, it could look like this. You recognize the two, and traditional management lies in that lower left-hand corner. And the way out of this traditional management, which I've used these rather harsh words to describe, but I've been around in so many companies in the world that this is unfortunately the case in so many organizations. And if we want to get out of this, if we believe that there's a high VUCA level there and that most people is on the Y side, then we must address, again, both leadership horizontally and our management processes vertically. On the leadership side, a few headlines: we need to be more purpose-based, more values-based, less rules-based. We are not saying no rules, we are saying less and more. There has to be more autonomy for obvious reasons. Transparency becomes that important word again. And in this context, it's good news for scared managers, finance people, afraid of losing that comfortable left-hand corner because they are afraid of losing control. Because transparency can actually be quite an effective control mechanism, a social control mechanism. And I love this story from the Swiss pharmaceutical company Roche, who today is on a beyond budgeting journey, by the way. And a few years ago, they did a very interesting experiment. In a pilot, they kicked out the travel budget, most travel rules and regulations, replaced it with full transparency. So with a few exceptions, everybody could see everything. And if you were traveling, to where did you fly, sleep, eat, cheap or expensive, open for your colleagues to see, and vice versa. And guess what happened with travel cost in that pilot? Came down through a very simple self-regulating control mechanism. But there is a but here. Transparency is a very powerful mechanism. It must be applied with wisdom. So if it becomes naming and shaming, then, as you know, it doesn't work. So that's why we should always position transparency more from a learning perspective than from a control perspective. How can we learn from each other if everything is secret? Last but not least, internal intrinsic motivation as opposed to external extrinsic motivation. And as you know, the most common way of motivating, especially managers extrinsically in business today, is individual bonus. And I can think of no area where there is a bigger gap between what most research is telling us about motivation and what most businesses is practicing. It's simply amazing. And I'm sure you are quite familiar with this. So you know that for knowledge work in knowledge organizations, then it's mastery, purpose, autonomy, belonging that is much more effective in helping people to motivate themselves than dangling that bag of money in front of people and say, do this and get that. I would actually call individual bonus for managerial laziness. It doesn't take much leadership. Anyway, a number of companies have the very best intentions when it comes to people and leadership. If you look at what they say, what they write, it's great stuff. But it doesn't help to have these theory Y leadership intentions if you have theory X management processes, because that creates these poisonous gaps between what is said and what is done. So if we are serious about these words, we have to change, adapt our management processes to make sure that they reflect these intentions, but not just that, also to make these processes more VUCA robust. A few headlines on what this means. Typically, the traditional detailed annual budget would have to go because it represents so much of what you find in that lower left-hand corner. More specifically, when we shall set goals and targets, to the extent we shall do that, because that's not obvious, then could we learn something from football? I have yet to meet a football team saying that the ambition for next season is to score 39 goals and get 42 points. Those are budget goals, and they don't think like that. They think in terms of league tables, if that's what we call it in Australia. I know the Americans call it something else. But anyway, you understand what I mean. It's all about doing well against others and hopefully better than everybody else. And that relative thinking can also be applied successfully in many areas in business, internally in organizations, and also comparing organizations. When it comes to the dynamics of these processes, why on earth shall everything circulate around a fiscal year of typically January to December? From a pure business point of view, that cycle is very often a completely artificial construct. So we need, where it's possible, where it makes sense, a more business-driven, more event-driven rhythm and a less calendar-driven rhythm. And last but not least, we cannot reduce performance evaluation to comparing two numbers, actual versus budget. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent performance evaluation. And this, folks, is what Beyond Budgeting is about, addressing both leadership and management processes in order to become more adaptive and more human. So this is the overall thinking behind. The model itself looked like this. I will not go through each of these principles in detail now, but I want to I will come back to some of the stuff on the right-hand side in a minute. But I'd like to share a few reflections with you around these principles. First of all, they were formulated first version back in 1998, so a few years before the Agile Manifesto. There are many similarities, but also some differences. Beyond budgeting, this tagline that we have, performance the right way, is also important here, because beyond budgeting changes how we define performance, how we deliver performance, how we evaluate performance, and how we reward performance the right way. And again, you can see that we have a strong focus on not just management processes, but just as much on leadership principles. And still, if you look at what we say on the left-hand side here, on, for instance, on purpose, values, transparency, autonomy, it's not that unique. You'll find the same spirit and some of the same words if you look at other communities and models, agile, lean, many others. But sometimes, or quite often actually, many of these leadership models have not reflected that much on what kind of management processes are needed to activate these good leadership intentions. That is what we offer in Beyond Budgeting on the right-hand side through very concrete, tangible management processes, which kind of brings these leadership intentions to life. These are principles. This is not a recipe. So what this should mean in an organization, that depends on that organization's business culture, history, and that is the way it should be. I don't like management recipes because in a management recipe, somebody has done all the thinking for you. The only thing you have to do is to read the books, hire the consultants, take the certification, tick the boxes. Well, it doesn't work here. Here, again, you have to think for yourself. That doesn't mean that we have a lot of proposals on what this could mean in more practical terms. But again, it is these principles that are the most important. And again, I mentioned that scaling agile is difficult because that scaling agile reveals the holes in agile because it was not designed as a way to run an enterprise. Agile, the manifesto, doesn't give you much advice if you look at the right-hand side on target setting, forecasting, resource allocation, performance evaluation, rewards. These are things that any executive will want answers on if you say that the whole organization has to be agile. And you can't find those answers in the Agile Manifesto. You find them in Beyond Budgeting. So the combination of the two is great. That is dynamite. But there can never be any true agile transformation, I would argue, without Beyond Budgeting. It's simply impossible. A number of companies are today on this journey in some form or shape, and I could have talked for hours and hours and hours about amazing cases here. You will have heard of some of them, but many others probably not. Unfortunately, we don't have many Australian companies here. I think the closest we come is, if you look at in the middle, almost at the bottom, main freight from New Zealand is a very exciting case, but guys, this is not good enough. So this has to change, and I'm sure it will change. I'm sure it will change. Again, we don't have the time to kind of dive into too much, but I'd like to mention one company here because it's quite special for many reasons. First of all, it's a pioneer. And I'm talking about the company that you see in the middle here at the top of the list in the middle, a bank called Handelsbanken. It's a Swedish bank with 700 branches in Northern Europe, quite big in the UK. And this is an interesting bank. And this is the guy that got it all started. Unfortunately, passed away some years ago. And this is one of many great things he said about budgeting. And again, it's a special bank because, first of all, I mean, they have no targets. They have no budgets. They have no individual bonus. They hardly do forecasting. But it doesn't stop here. They have been doing this since 1970. But it doesn't stop here either. This bank has been performing better than the average of its competitors every single year since 1972. And how? By having a very simple strategy, which is that we want to have perform better than the others by having better customer satisfaction and lower cost than competitors. And how have they achieved that? Well, by applying the beyond budgeting principles. These guys actually inspired many of the principles together with some other companies. A lot of autonomy, a lot of empowerment in the branches, a lot of transparency, a lot of football thinking. So no company financial targets, just an ambition to do better than the average of the competitors, which they have done every year since 1972. And internally in the bank, a lot of benchmarking between branches, so that they not just kind of, it drives performance in a friendly competition, but just as much from the learning perspective, that they can learn from each other. So again, very, very interesting case. And one example that this is good for performance. So this is one indication, but another indication is that if you look at these companies on this list, very few companies go back once they've started. I don't need one hand to count the number of companies going back. The very few who did, it was either about a flawed implementation or about a significant change in top management at an early stage of the journey. But beyond that, companies do not go back. On the contrary, they get braver along the way. So I was responsible for heading up implementation in Equinor, which you see next to Handelsbanken on the top here, where we kicked out the budget and much more back in 2005. And the last discussion we had before I left was about, do we need targets at all? And the conclusion was that the company actually kicked out many of its targets as well. Anyway, we have lately started to receive some additional information or indications that this is good for performance, because the big consulting companies have gotten, over the last couple of years, seriously interested in beyond budgeting, and two of them have made surveys among clients and others about, well, what do you think about beyond budgeting? And one of them is BCG, Boston Consulting Group. And here is, sorry, I'm missing a slide. Okay, I don't think I have that slide here, but let me just share with you what it says. Boston Consulting Group, they asked companies who have implemented beyond budgeting, well, what kind of benefits do they see? And there was a lot of benefits, and the most kind of profound one which 60% of them experienced was higher sales than earlier budget sales targets, which was actually some kind of sales ceilings. But they also reported many other positive effects, higher agility and resource allocation, better decisions, less gaming, and so on and so on. So a very positive survey coming out from Boston Consulting Group. Another consulting company, Bain and Company, they had a slightly different angle. They have defined a group of what they call leading companies in financial planning. And then they compare to what extent do these leading companies apply the beyond budgeting principles compared to the rest. And the result was, I mean, very convincing, because there was the big difference between the two groups, where the leading companies, all of them applied all of the principles much more than the rest. Of course, this is not proof as such. These are indications, but quite strong indications. So we strongly believe this is good for performance. But some people, especially finance people and some managers, when they see the beyond budgeting principles for the first time, they get a bit scared, right? They find that this is quite big, quite overwhelming. I don't think you guys look upon them like that, but a lot of finance people do, and many executives. For these guys, we have some good news. We have a very simple, practical, not scary, very logical way of getting started, and it has to do with asking ourselves a very simple question: why do we budget? And when I say budget here, you need to think about the broad definition, the broad finance definition of budgets, which is more than cost budgets. It's also profit and loss budgets, cash flow budgets, and so on and so on. And companies actually have three different reasons for making budgets. First of all, the budgets shall serve as targets for next year, financial targets, sales targets, production targets. At the same time, that budget shall be some kind of forecast of what next year could look like in terms of cash flow, profit and loss. And the third purpose is resource allocation, handing out back some money to the organization on OPEX and CAPEX. And it might seem very efficient to solve all three in one process and one set of numbers, but that is also the problem. This is the conflicting purposes problem I talked about earlier. Because what happens if we move into a budget process and upstairs, let's assume that finance want to understand next year's cash flow, and they start on the revenue income side and ask responsible people, what are your best numbers for next year? But everybody knows that what I'm sending upstairs will come back to me as a target for next year, maybe with a bonus attached to it. And trust me, that has a tendency to do something with the level of numbers submitted. And I think you know which way those numbers would move. Moving to the cost side, the same people, other people are asked, what are your best numbers for next year? But everybody knows that this is my only shot at getting access to resources for next year. And most people will probably also remember that 20% cut from last year. And that insight and that memory will also do something to the level of numbers submitted. And I think you know which way the numbers will go this time. And this is a problem, not just because it destroys the quality of numbers, but also because it stimulates this mindset that we talked about, this behavior that we talked about, which is at least borderline unethical. At the same time, not blaming anyone for behaving like this, because they are just responding to the system we have designed for them to operate in. So if you want to change this, it's not about fixing people, it's about fixing systems, which is what beyond budgeting does. And in this case, it's about separating the three into three different processes, because these are different things. A target is an aspiration, it's what we want to happen, while a forecast is an expectation, it's what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not. And resource allocation is about optimizing scarce resources in the best possible way. And once we have separated, then these can be different numbers and done in different ways. A target can, for instance, be more ambitious than a forecast, like it typically should be. But even more important, we can start to improve each one in ways impossible when it was all bundled in one process and one set of numbers on the left-hand side. So we can have great discussions about how to set targets that, or how people can set themselves targets that really inspire and stretch without feeling stretched. And thinking football here can be a key in some cases. Then we can work on getting the bias and the politics out of the forecasting so that we know we can trust the numbers. And also we don't need a million details here. We are looking at the future. There's uncertainty, which is very different from looking at the past through accounting, where all the uncertainty is gone. And last but not least, how can we find more intelligent ways of managing cost compared to what Mr. McKinsey could offer us 100 years ago? And when we have split the three, we can also now organize each of them on a rhythm which not just better reflects the kind of business we're in, but also each purpose. Because we would change targets much less often than forecasting, and resource allocation, as I will come back to, will take place continuously. So you might have questions around all three, but since we've got limited time, I just want to share a little bit more on resource allocation, how to manage cost without a budget, because that is where most of the questions are. So let me do that. And another leading question here. Imagine an organization who needs fuel to produce. What would the best way be for this organization to be supplied with fuel? Would it be the budget way, a fixed number of fuel cans delivered once a year, January 1? Or would it be access to a pipeline where you can consume more if you produce more, and vice versa? And that was my biggest leading question of today. Whatever tools and processes we put in place instead of the traditional budget, they have to be built on a platform of cost consciousness. And that implies asking different questions than what we typically hear in the budget world. In the budget world, the classical question is, when you should do something that costs money, do I have a budget for this? And if you have, it's okay. If you don't have, it's not okay. A bit simplified, but you understand what I mean. We would like to hear more questions of the kind you see on the right-hand side, right? What is good enough? How much value is this creating? Is this within my execution framework? As you will see, this is not an anarchy. There are still guardrails, but of a very different type. And these are questions that we should ask on every cent, every dollar we are spending. For some companies, this mindset combined with a bit of transparency is enough. Bigger company needs something more. The more typically falls into two categories. When it comes to investments, projects, then we recommend beyond budgeting version of continuous delivery, namely a process based on a very simple principle: the bank is always open. Right? You can always forward a project for approval at any time. Yes or no depends on two things: how good is your project, and can we afford it as things look today? So a much more continuous process, not that difficult. A bit more challenging on operating cost, admin cost. How do we manage travel cost without a budget? But we do have some recommendations here as well. We have a menu of alternatives. We want to leave behind the traditional detailed budget and move to the right. This is one alternative. There is still a number in the range of 1,000, 1 million, 1,000 within that full autonomy. But we can make it even more self-regulating, move from absolute thinking to relative thinking. And relative can mean, for instance, unit production cost. You can spend more if you produce more. Benchmarked unit cost. Or if you have internal profit centers who fully control both their own income and cost, if that unit has a tough bottom line target, they cannot run away and spend money like crazy. But it might be okay to spend more if what they spend is what we call good cost, because good cost is not a problem. As long as we have the money, we want more good cost. It's the bad cost we want to get rid of. The last alternative here is nothing at all. No budget, no target, no constraints, only monitoring of actual cost. Here we look at trends, for instance, through control charts. If it looks okay, we do nothing. If it looks a bit strange, we investigate. If we see an upward sticking trend, it might be okay. It might be a doses of good cost, but we might also come across teams managers who consciously or unconsciously abuse the trust that lies in this model. And the only thing you know if you show trust in an organization is that someone will abuse it, right? So that's not the question. It will happen. So the question is, how should executives respond? And the wrong but simple response that we've seen a few of is this trust thing doesn't work, everybody back to the old budget. Very simple, but wrong. The right response is to deal firmly with those involved and let it have the necessary consequences. This is not about being soft. It's about not putting everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. Back to the clothing hanger example. The further to the right we are, the stronger we need to be on values and direction. And I think you understand why. And in addition, then there are two kind of additional guardrails that actually most companies have in place already. Decision authorities, how big decisions can managers make expressed in money before they have to go one level up, and also spending guidelines. Like in Equinor, we had no travel budgets, but there is a principle that if you fly in Europe, you fly coach economy, intercontinental, you can fly business. Has nothing to do with travel budgets. It just helps companies to make better decisions. So that's what I wanted to share with you. What you just have heard was the very, very short version of all of this. This is a longer version. It's a book I wrote. Actually, the first version came out some years ago. This is a heavily updated second edition from 2016, which has more of everything, more cases. There's also a chapter about beyond budgeting in agile because of the many similarities here. And also something called the Borealis case, which was my first beyond budgeting project, 1995, before there was anything called beyond budgeting. This was Europe's largest petrochemicals company at the time. The issue with books like this is that they take some time to read, and the ones we really need to reach, they have limited time. So my last book, which is just out, is a thinner book, more focused, aimed at executives and other business people. That's why it's also out in an audio book. And I was very happy that Gary Hamel wrote the foreword. I mean, you might know the guy, but I mean, he is, in my view, #1 on management innovation in the world. A fantastic speaker and a fantastic author as well. So that's what I wanted to share with you. These are my contact details. If you want to follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn, highly appreciated. I only write about this stuff. There are no cats and dogs and grandchildren, I promise. And this is the website to the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, which is an international network then of organizations and individuals interested in this, and also a link to my own homepage. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Yes, let's thank Bjarte. Thank you so much for sharing all that. The applause in the form of emoji is good too.
Thank you.
I just shared a link to the course that Bjarte is doing on the 21st, 22nd, which is just under 1 month away now.
Yeah, thanks.
And questions. We have one so far that I've noticed. Please keep them coming. The one might have been in reaction to me just pointing out the sanitarium seemed to be on the list, as well as Atlassian.
Oh, yes. Oh, I forgot those guys. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
And Tesla, of course. Yeah, but I think I don't, not too many.
Yeah.
Should have been more. Should have been more. But you're right. Yes.
True. The question from LP was, may I please ask what got both of them started, and how was their journey and the lessons learned from their implementation challenges? Don't know how many details you've got on those two specific ones.
Do you mean in general for companies? How to get started?
Well, I guess, yeah, they're curious about sanitarium and Atlassian being, I guess,
okay.
examples,
well,
but maybe you have, depending on how much you know about those ones.
No, I mean, I've met both the CFO and the main controller in Santorini, but it's I don't know the details of the case. And also Atlassian, it's been quite a while since I've been in touch with that company. But in general, I can say that when it comes to getting started, what we recommend, and there's no rocket science here, is make sure you have a solid case for change, so that there's a common understanding in the organization. What kind of problems are we trying to solve, and what are we aiming towards instead? The better job you do here, the easier everything is afterwards. So don't kind of, if you get fascinated, just don't run back to your own organization and say that we have to go beyond budgeting and pushing a medicine on someone that maybe haven't understood that they are sick. Second recommendation, start with that budget purpose separation that I talked about. Separate into these three different processes. Once you have separated and started the improvement discussions, then you are on the journey. And in having those improvement discussions, find inspiration from the left-hand side of the Beyond Budgeting Principles on leadership. Plus do things that kind of makes your management processes more VUCA robust. So I've helped around, I guess, 40 of those companies on that list getting started, and for the big majority, that is where we started out.
Yeah, wonderful. And maybe I've got a follow-on question about that case for change. Have you got any thoughts on, approaching it from the perspective of the frustrations and the problems with the existing budgeting approach or related approaches, or to what degree might you kind of offer the aspirational kind of angle of imagining how things could be if we had things a different way, kind of thing? What have you found there?
I mean, what some companies do is to run surveys about how the organization feels about the existing management processes, including budgeting. And typically, I mean, that is quite, especially in bigger companies, it's quite a scary picture that typically emerges, and it often surprises executives, because from their perspective, this is quite a rational and efficient process. They don't see all the dysfunctional behaviors out there. They don't understand how much time it takes and so on. So doing that can be a way to kind of to wake up executives. And of course, it helps these days to kind of gently point to all the companies that are doing this these days. And if some of these companies are in your own business, I mean, that might create some interest, some peer pressure. That's not my favorite kind of starting point, but if nothing else works, then I wouldn't shy away from using that one. Absolutely not.
Thank you. Another question from, I think, Maurice, Julian, and Fudge. Is there a cultural aspect in terms of country culture to consider in the success of the implementation?
Now, that's of course a question we get a lot for good reasons, and of course the answer is yes, and there are cultural differences. At the same time, they should never be allowed to be kind of showstoppers. If you look to Equinor, that is a company that operates globally in many different cultures. It's the same model that applies all over. So if culture is an issue, you just have to roll up your sleeves and work even harder. And also, there is a number of things you can do on management processes, which is not culture sensitive, like introducing rolling forecasting, relative targets, and so on and so on. Again, yes, it is an issue, but don't make it into a showstopper.
Yeah, so there's a follow-up bit about how Scandinavian countries and Germanic ones seem to have the head start. Do you have any thoughts on, maybe why the United States or, other countries are maybe not quite as prominent in this? Is it partly the round table, I guess, this was a bit more of a thing in Europe, right? Yeah.
No, I'm actually writing about this in my latest book. It's when it comes to the US, there are some US companies, but not many, not in relative terms, actually quite few so far. But if you look at a lot of the other management stuff out there, OKRs, balanced scorecard, activity-based costing, it was invented in the US, right? And it's probably easier to adopt something invented in your own country. beyond budgeting was invented, or the inspiration came from companies, as you said, mainly in Europe and especially Scandinavia. So I think that is an absolute an issue. But again, that is cultural thing. It shouldn't be allowed to be a showstopper. And we got amazing cases in China, in Brazil, Japan, right, which have cultures which are quite different from the Scandinavian ones.
Thank you. Arpad, you got a question about, or are you there? Do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, hello.
Good, yeah.
Thanks, Bjarte, for the presentation. That was excellent. A good eye opener. My question was around obviously your interaction with companies, and you probably faced some resistance regarding your principles, and they questioned why. And which part of the organization usually this resistance comes? Because you have a layered organization with hierarchies. So is it top, medium, bottom, or something like that? So that's my question. Thanks.
I think when it comes to resistance, then it could be executives. It could also be the finance function, actually, in some cases. But when it comes to confusion, then of course you also need to include all middle managers who kind of initially would struggle to understand how shall I now manage without the budget. Because they feel like kind of something they know that is safe, even if they know it's dysfunctional, it's taken away from them. So it's important to help these people to understand that, like for instance, on control, losing control. Yes, there are some controls we should lose, the bad ones, but you get more of what we call the good controls. Like for instance, transparency. It's a good control mechanism. But the important thing is to get started. Again, because so few go back once they have started. And these days, it does help to have so many big companies on the list, because that is what some executives need to see, that other companies are doing this. It helps that the big consulting companies are endorsing beyond budgeting. That is something that some executives also, if they hear from these guys, then it must be something to it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Anna, you've got a question there. Did you want to ask it?
Hey, thank you, Ron. Thank you, Bjarte. My question was, how do you approach that? Can you, let's say, start small, let's say with a pilot with one business unit, see how that goes, and maybe build yourself some champions there and then scale it up to the rest of the organization? Or is it the wrong approach?
No, that is absolutely possible. If you have, especially if you have units that are relatively kind of independent already from a business point of view, then it's absolutely you can start with a pilot. Roche, for instance, which I mentioned, that's what they did. They actually started out in Sweden, and then corporate coming on board later on. And we also said that even if you don't have a formal permission, your autonomy to do something as head of that unit is often bigger than what you think. Then we have a recommendation which we call up with the umbrella, which means that when the stupid corporate requirements come from above, then as a head of that unit, don't turn around and let it all pass out in your organization. Up with the umbrella, stop at your level, use your finance function typically to kind of fend off and feed the corporate system with the information they want. But internally in that unit, you operate along these principles as much as possible. It's not the ideal solution, but it's better than nothing. But of course, nothing is better than being a legal pilot instead of an illegal pilot.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Thank you. Ryan, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, this is super fascinating, and I work in a very large government department. Who I'd imagine that this sounds so great, but I could imagine trying to have this discussion inside of this department and their heads spinning. I'm sure you've seen that many times. What do you do? You know, you talked about scaling and agile and how that's you know, that can be a challenge area and sometimes it doesn't work. And what do you do if, you know, you're trying to sell this idea of beyond budgeting to the leadership of a very large organization and they say, oh, that might work great for a, you know, a mum and dad shop with 5 people and they can all talk to each other and have these discussions. We're so big, it would never work somewhere. We got to have this top-down approach. How do you sort of, yeah, bridge that with them? What do you say to that?
But first of all, I mean, I think the largest company on that list has close to 400,000 employees. So this is not just a kind of mom and dad shop issue, and it works great for them. But I mean, it goes back to what I just said. I mean, build that case for change. Help these people to understand how dysfunctional the current processes are. And then help them to see when that job is done, help them to see a vision of something better, and then offer the separation of the budget purposes as a first tangible step to get started on the journey. And an additional argument you can use is to let them reflect on the risk picture here, which is quite compelling. Because think about it, the downside risk is minimal. If it doesn't work, the organization can go back to budgeting tomorrow. Not a single soul will have forgotten how to do it. And compare that minimal downside risk with this huge upside potential. All these companies who do not go back because it does work and who get braver along the way. So again, quite a compelling risk picture. Yeah. By the way, do you work in the public sector or?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm writing about this in my book as well, because there's a very high interest in the public sector, and we have a fascinating pilot in a Norwegian public sector unit. Has the big one with social services and labor and so on, and they have 12 contact centers across the country. And I met with these guys in 2019, and from 2020, they told 2 of the 12 that you can operate without any cost budget whatsoever. Spend what is necessary to do a good job, but not more. And when the year was over, they could look at the results. And this was, of course, the first year of the pandemic. So everybody had lower external costs, but no one had bigger cost reductions than these 2 pilots, minus 50% in both. So from 21, they got braver, 6 of 12, and today all 12 contact centers operate without cost budgets, and it works wonderful. So I think that's not going to be kind of the next area for beyond budgeting to expand into the public sector. We actually got a municipality in Norway with 12,000 inhabitants who have a decision to go beyond budgeting as the first one in Norway. So that's going to be very exciting.
Wow, yeah, that sounds like quite a breakthrough.
That's awesome.
Yeah. We do have one other question. I'm not sure LP is here right now, but it seems like a pretty generally relevant one. Based on your observation, what are the top 5 critical success factors to implement beyond budgeting? I think you might have spoken about a couple of them.
Yeah, I actually think I've touched upon most of them already. Again, the case for change, then make executives understand kind of the seriousness of these problems. Again, look to peers and other companies doing this. Start with that separation. Yeah. And also think about that compelling risk picture, minimal downside risk and huge upside potential.
Very good. Is anyone sitting on one more question?
I think there's one here.
You are there. Yeah, we can't hear you though. Sorry. Yeah, maybe do you want to just type it into chat if the audio's not working there? Sorry. Yeah, those of you still on the call, yeah, I really do recommend looking into this more if you're interested in this sort of topic. And yeah, Julie is the person to speak with at Complexability. I've shared the link in the chat there. And it would be great to see another Australian organisation, you know, pilot this.
Yes.
Yeah, I know there's quite a interesting bunch of people have been around on the various scenes, agile finance and things, who been following Bjarte's work closely and are very interested in this sort of thing in Australia. So, and again, if anyone's interested in getting in touch with one or two of those folks, and everywhere from Sydney to Perth, I can put you in touch too. Just just LP, just asking to repeat the last point. That was about the risk angle.
Compelling risk picture.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point for a lot of change. That no one's going to forget how we've been working for years and years and years, isn't it? And it's kind of like, is this a reversible thing? I think, imagine, I think that idea of guardrails too, just to riff off what Bjarte was saying, right? If people are concerned that, people might abuse the kind of situation, well, can we not innovate the guardrails that could put things in place to make it transparent, the sort of, like you say, the peer honesty, right? When people can see, others doing something which is not really kind of in the greater good. I think those sort of things can be, resolved in quite an effective way. So, yeah, I picked up a few things tonight. Thanks, everyone. I hope you picked up a few things too. Can we all show our appreciation for Bjarte? Feel free to unmute or just
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for making your time available for us from the other side of the world, Bjarte, and even though you're not feeling 100% today, so really appreciate it. And yeah, everyone stay in touch. Please reach out if you've got any questions about how to connect with Bjarte other than just